Hey guys, just a very quick introduction to this one. I wish I had time to go through and find all of the relevant bits of video for this, but I don't have that kind of time. So today we've got some just general background footage. It doesn't really matter because the most important thing is what we're talking about. Hope you enjoy. Now, if I were to say to you, are FPS games based around wars which were horrific, are they therefore distasteful or inappropriate? You'd probably say to me, no, don't be stupid, Luton, because FPS games bear no resemblance to their real-world comparisons, and anyway, the vast majority of people are more than capable of separating fiction from reality. But some people say yes, notably journalists who in the past 48 hours have started to roll the bandwagon of the First World War was bad, and therefore big games based off of it must therefore be distasteful. Now granted, those journalists using terms like shooting game and gamify, which you would always associate with quality journalism, and experienced FPS players for that matter, yet they say yes, war games are bad. Wired, The Guardian and something called Shack News all decided to kickstart the outrage wagon this week. But why are we still having these reactionary articles? Hasn't this been discussed enough by now? Now I'm going to use an example of Hatred, the game that you'll remember. At the time now, I was quite outraged by that game when it first was sort of revealed. But as a game, it actually helped me realise that to be outraged or offended by a game is actually completely ridiculous. Hatred, after its hyped up media fest, never really appeared on most people's radar because it was unsurprisingly a really boring game. It was this that actually had the most impact, not the shock or morality about its subject matter. Now, ordinarily, I would roll my eyes at articles like these and just get on with my day, but I just felt annoyed at the fact that these mainstream sites get away with posting this bullshit constantly. So instead of just leaving a small comment that nobody's ever going to read, I thought I would instead do this video. And not only would I make this video, but I would also gather some of your opinions from not just players, but also ex or serving forces members, of whom I know many watch this channel. So I guess it was almost inevitable that after the old school news sites had run out of things to talk about from the Battlefield 1 press release, they would jump onto anything else to keep those clicks coming in. I actually saw this one coming a mile away, to be honest. I was thinking about it actually on the reveal night of how loud and proud the trailer was and how that didn't gel too much with what I would picture from World War I. Still though, not gelling and inappropriate are two different things. Before I get into this too far though, I will say that the Guardian's piece generally was not so much directly aimed at Battlefield 1's setting, but was more generally asking, is it okay for any game that we play for multiplayer enjoyment to be set in the backdrop of a real war? The answer to that is obviously yes, it's fine, but for Christ's sake, why not just explain why it's fine in your article instead of leaving it as like a lazy question at the end? It's not a hard question to answer and it just comes across as lazy. The others you can check out as well, they're fun. Always the classic preemptive defense in there as well about how the author loves FPS, they love shooters, they love it all. But, always a but in there. Look, let's just get to the root of the matter. The question is really not, is it okay for Battlefield to set a new game to the backdrop of World War I because it's distasteful, a war very widely known for its appalling conditions and industrial loss of life on both sides. The question is, why are any war games appropriate? And not just games, how about Hollywood movies, which are often either complete fiction or semi-based on reality, which just means sexed up. Even books, it's all just fictional consumption for our entertainment. Well, unlike the Guardian's piece, I will tell you, the answer is that we enjoy these things because it's something fictional. And we are capable of separating this from reality. People enjoy the interaction, the dynamic of survival and the retelling of the human condition, exploring that in all the various different medias in both fiction and non-fiction. People enjoy violence in fiction. It's one of those weird human quirks, which means we happily will watch a horror movie understanding that it's total fantasy. Very often games handle that border between fiction and non-fiction very poorly. I remember completing Call of Duty's World at War campaign. At the end, a message flashes up, and I don't remember exactly, I'm just off the top of my head. It says something like, "This game is dedicated to all the brave men of World War II," or something like this. I nearly spat my drink out at the time. It was so ridiculous to imagine anybody who served in World War II would give a damn about this cliched pulp narrative. And then to top it off, out of the mists walk Nazi zombies. It was just completely absurd. COD is probably not the best example, to be honest, of a competent narrative, but this one just stood out in my mind. Anyway, it's good for games to make you feel a little uncomfortable. If you didn't have a small flag up in your mind at the prospect of gunning down innocent civilians, or even waves of enemy soldiers, real or not, then you could argue it might be time to see a psychologist. Yet this isn't exclusive to games, as I pointed out, nor is it exclusive to war games. I find the latest Tomb Raider iterations to have a bit more combat than feels necessary to actually a dulling degree. I wish Lara would spend more time solving puzzles, archaeology, exploring the beautiful environments and really getting involved in them in a kind of Myst style, more than she does headshotting anonymous goons with a bow and arrow, or dying herself in extremely brutal yet comically entertaining ways. Games, believe it or not, are highly capable of adding or inspiring great commentary to real-world issues. I wouldn't go as far to say they are educational necessarily, but they make you think about a subject and then perhaps go and look up those issues further. Two excellent examples of this are the brilliant survival game This War of Mine and the indie game Papers, Please. Both deal with harsh realities that are uncomfortable, but with entertaining game mechanics to boot. Now, again, granted they do not overly glorify any part of the experience as Battlefield 1 does with its trailer, yet the principle of wanting to know more about the subject matter you're experiencing is still there. Now, just casually following social media this week, I've seen a great many people throwing up links and YouTube channels to explore the history of World War I. I myself was just thinking one day about dogs being used in the war and found some interesting information I never knew about how they were used. So while the games themselves are hardly educational, they do have the potential to inspire the desire to learn more, and that's certainly a positive thing, and I think that applies to any game with a background based in reality. Now, I would strongly recommend that if you're not familiar with the history of the First World War, to go and watch the BBC documentary series The Great War, which was kind of like a pre-series to The World at War, which is a very famous series about World War II. Now, this covers the entire period in accurate and sadly unforgiving detail, and I'll just show you a little clip from that right now.
By the end of April, after 70 days fighting, the Germans had lost 120,000 men. The French had lost 133,000.
The battle was no longer an episode that spent itself in blood and fire. It was a thing that dug itself in remorselessly week after week. They breathed in the smell of a tormented world. A smell like that of a planet in the process of being reduced to ashes. Most of them had given up all hope of surviving.
I saw a man drinking from a scum-covered green marsh, where a dead man lay, his black face downward in the water, lying on his stomach and swollen as if he'd not stopped filling himself with water for days.
Having despaired of living amid such horror, we begged God not to have us killed. The transition is too atrocious, but just to let us be dead.
There is also a great YouTube channel named The Great War, which also sets through the history in episodic format. Both of these are excellent, they're worth checking out. World War I was a horrific war, there is no question. But isn't every war a horrific war? Vietnam, World War II, Falklands, Korea, the list goes on. Then there are the horrors of war as well. Atomic weapons in Japan, napalm use in Vietnam, that indelible image of the young girl running down the street with the skin literally burned off of her. Or what about recently in Syria, President Assad shelling civilians, going house to house, killing unarmed civilians, using chemical gas on his own people. Right up until last week, a refugee camp on the border of Syria and Turkey suffered an airstrike which no one has held their hands up to. What a great surprise that is. War is an inhumanity wherever and whenever it occurs. But games are not war, movies are not war, television is not war. I'll say it again, people can make the differentiation between fiction and reality. Now let's think about other instances in which games are lauded, yet actually are horrific in reality. The D-Day landings. This is often very regularly represented in historical military games because, it's a grand event and it's praised for its realism or simply being awesome in its atmosphere. But in reality, we know that it was a horrific nightmare. How about the openings of Medal of Honor Rising Sun, where you have to escape a sinking battleship in Pearl Harbor, with dying US sailors all around you, bodies floating in the water, burning ships? It's not pleasant, but it's part of that game there. Is it distasteful to showcase that? Now, even the introduction of Call of Duty 4, Chernobyl and Pripyat, one of the defining moments of the game with its eerie setting and crumbling city. Is this disrespectful to the people who had to flee their homes after being severely irradiated for days during the Chernobyl disaster, that, you would turn this into people's entertainment? Battlefield Vietnam, Bad Company 2 Vietnam. I think it's firmly established that Vietnam was not a war anyone would class as anything, again, other than horrific. But I will direct you to the litany of movies and documentaries to this end. Yet you know what one of my favourite features is in Bad Company 2 Vietnam? Taking those double-mounted machine gun patrol boats and raining hell down on the enemy on the shoreline. Why? Because it's massive fun. Now let's go back to Call of Duty again. We all remember the extremely controversial airport scene in Modern Warfare 2, where you had to walk through the airport gunning down unarmed civilians. Yes, it was appalling, and my god, so much outrage in the media over this one. It was so bad they actually had to enable you to skip it because, they were concerned that some people might be triggered and unable to handle it. In reality, it was boring as hell. I couldn't wait for it to end, just wandering around, shooting AI, cardboard cutout targets. They were dull, 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 bang, bang, bang. It was boring. And lastly, who remembers in COD World at War that you could literally, the mechanics they had in the multiplayer, you could literally blow people's limbs off with blood everywhere. Hardly tasteful. Games are imaginary, they are fiction, they are little boys running around a garden with plastic guns shooting, going pew pew pew, and then arguing over who it was that was meant to be dead. Now, very often as a producer for an FPS shooter, you're talking about how efficiently to kill other players. I often find myself thinking it's a bit strange to be talking about how to more efficiently kill others. Similarly, I have talked to friends before about how in television and movies, such a huge percentage of stories all hinge around one thing: murder. We as a society are obsessed with it. Soap operas, drama, movies, it's death, 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 everywhere. People love it, they can't get enough death. And when we aren't inventing death, we have documentaries about death, serial killers all over the place. It's absolute nonsense to try and say a game is inappropriate just because it features a war, because then you start getting into the realms of one war being better than another or worse than another, and from there really what you're talking about is how important is a human life. Is this what mainstream journalists are suggesting, that we quantify human life, and unless we are seeing losses in the hundreds of thousands, then it's not enough to qualify for being offensive? Now let's look at something arguably more socially inappropriate then instead. You could easily have made the case, and from memory I think I nearly decided to actually, that right in the middle of a massive social debate about US police militarization, you had Battlefield Hardline. Depending on your perspective, running around with assault rifles in the streets blowing away suspects while the real US police were doing the same thing, as well as walking up and down pointing guns at unarmed protesters. This wasn't the best time for a game of this nature. I jokingly said to one of the Visceral devs around the release time that wouldn't it be funny, and I mean funny in my typical dark sarcastic way, to mention this comparison on a video, and they replied, probably best not. There is another disparity here though as well. If war games are so offensive and morally bankrupt, how is it that a reasonable proportion of that player base, now I've got no stats to hand about that, but I'm just basing it off of my own personal experiences, that player base who are serving or ex-service members? Now we see charities even set up to provide military personnel in active service consoles in the bases to play shooters on. Now, I remember reading how they would use these games to de-stress after patrols and so on. And strangely, these examples never make it into articles questioning the moral acceptability of military games. You might think that they would take the time to get some opinion from forces members who play military games to add that into their articles, into their debate, but they never do. But I have. I asked on Twitter and on a short video tonight for ex-forces and serving force members to give their opinions to me. It might not surprise you to find that the general consensus was that this was a nonsensical argument to make. So here we go. Evan says, I'm a former British soldier, served in Iraq, Afghanistan, actually suffered with post-traumatic stress disorder and suffer panic attacks on a regular basis. I actually wake up from having them. When I left the army, I found playing war combat games relaxed me. I'm actually good at them and they take my mind off of issues. And my favourite games are modern games that have relatable maps in actual places of conflict. My passion for FPS games probably stems from my military past somewhat. COD 4 is where it all started for me. Bob Warrior says, Hi Luton, as an ex-Canadian infantry soldier, the idea of war games being inappropriate is ridiculous. I remember when the first GTA game came out and the world then began blaming every school shooting and other events due to people playing the game along with CS. I've naturally always been drawn to war games even as a kid because my dream was to serve my country, but my experiences with war games didn't lead me to my time in the military. I've always found them relaxing, but always bring me back to teamwork and having a good time. When I hear articles or news broadcasts blaming people for actions due to violent games, I wonder where the proof is. My time in the military, I can say that in no way does a game represent the military life. Not even a movie can truly depict events seen by troops who have been in real combat situations. Kids and adults who play these games like to have fun and immerse themselves away from life and enjoy themselves. I don't see that as inappropriate. Next we got Tommy, who says, I'm going to be in the reserve army for the next 40 or so years. Haven't played much else than Arma 3 for the last year because it serves as a really good platform for training, mainly leadership and tactics and so on. I'm not saying games like Battlefield and COD are all bad, but they don't serve me like Arma does. I am after immersion, which Battlefield and COD clearly don't provide, or certainly don't provide. Making World War I into Battlefield's alternative setting is kind of inappropriate, and it kind of isn't. I thought this was one of the best comments. Silius, US Army vet here. It is a video game, it is fantasy. If you cannot distinguish the difference, well, video games aren't for you. Probably should have just made that my whole video, to be honest. Right, Roll Cage coming with an opinion down from Australia here. War, does it need justification? Interested to hear what you make of it. He's talking about this video. Ex-tank dude, didn't see active, but my old man went to Nam. Living with that was bad enough, but bears no resemblance to playing a game. When I hear the gyros sound in Battlefield 4 tanks, I have a little bit of a smile, but there's no choking cordite or a crew commander screaming. One of my great-grandfathers served in Gallipoli and later on the Western Front. When you read about the accounts, no game could take you there. I think go for it in games, why not? My grandfathers both served in New Guinea against Japan after Singapore capitulated and so on. Like other families, ours have had our share. I just think maybe there is now a market for more flags in Battlefield titles. The Cold War era, European, always American focused. Slouch hat would be cool to see, I think we all agree. Darren says, I've learned a lot more about the history of wars and conflicts from playing video games and films than I ever did in a history lesson at school. Games are not just about killing, there's stories to be told. I am ex-forces. This is a comment from Newell's friend Furley, who was a combat engineer in the US Army. They sent this to me via Twitter direct message. He said, Lol, this is the first time I've heard about any current controversy regarding Battlefield 1 or war games in general. Whatever. Sounds like the same bullshit that gets thrown around from time to time by some idiot or group of idiots who thinks you should think the way they do. They're offended, so there must be something wrong with you if you're not also offended. Fucking thought police. War video games don't belittle the truth of war any more than a movie or novel of the same subject. If someone doesn't like it and it harms no one, they need to ignore it and move along as opposed to highlighting their own ignorance. I think that's a pretty fair statement. Okay, Jafar says he's a long-time fan, but first comment, so I had to include it. He says, I've currently served almost 15 years in the military and can say from my experience I have no problem with military FPS games. I know most of the people I've served with highly enjoy the competitive nature and friendships you develop from each game's community. To believe that military shooters are offensive to the memory of those who serve is akin to saying the games 100% represent soldiers and their experiences. Anyone with any common sense can see that's not feasible. Soldiers see the games as they are meant to be, enjoyable entertainment right along the lines of war movies, novels and shows. Again, it's common sense. George gave me a short comment on Twitter. I miss doing combat readiness exercises and other training in the Marine Corps. In a military FPS, I can get a little bit of that feeling. So again, it's people, using it for what they get out of it. Okay, and the last comment goes across to Fabius. He says, I was in the US Army for 6 years, 2 deployments to Afghanistan. I play military games all the time. I played Arma 3 with you the other night. They're not distasteful at all. World War I happened. Nothing a game can do will change it. World War II happened. Same thing. Is it wrong to make money off of these things by making a game? No. Too many people make money off of far worse things than a damn video game, picking a target they know is a minority issue to build a soapbox on. No scientific study has shown any proof violent video games make a person violent. Hell, gamers tend to have better hand-to-eye coordination, improved decision-making skills due to the need to react to quicker occurrences. I actually find that happens totally. There are always those very subtle reminders in games to let us know that they're not real. Reminders like falling through the map on Battlefield, or being able to paradrop out of an exploding jet only to be picked up by a helicopter midair and then bailing out again and using a javelin midair to shoot at a tank on the ground. Subtle things like that. Also, having your tank in armour hit a rock the size of a football and then the tank flips over. That's always a classic. Not to mention AI soldiers who literally just walk through walls. And of course, that unique feature that defines the difference between games and reality, respawning. Because, as we all remember, FPS Doug said it best.
Sometimes I think maybe I want to join the army. I mean, it's basically like FPS, except better graphics. But what happens if I get lag out there? I'm dead! I mean, I even heard there's no respawn points in RL.